This weekend, hey cool, we still have national parks. I ask you to direct your attention to a part of the oldest recorded cattle trail in Texas, specifically the site of Collier's Ferry, what is now a park on the Natchez River in the Big Thicket Reserve along the eastern border of Texas, where it runs up against Louisiana. I talked about pig drives of this period a few episodes ago, but this is a relic of the earliest cattle drives out of Texas to the port of New Orleans. This section of the Natchez River is where a bunch of the beef swam itself across the Natchez so it could head over for the port, likely overlapping with parts of the Natchez Trace that I covered back in episode 102 when I was talking about early gumbo and jambalaya. To give you a sense of scope, Houston to New Orleans is about 350 miles or 560 kilometers. These cattle would have moved along at about 15 miles or 24 kilometers per day, which meant that a trip from ranch to port likely took about a month to complete. No wonder the rail lines changed the game. This well-exercised beef went into the local economy, but also headed out to sea as salt beef and up the Mississippi to fan out into the rivers of America, so it might go to the expanding military presence on America's expanding western border. I mean, those pickled tongues being eaten by the officers in Arkansas had to come from somewhere. And I'm sure every 19th century person involved in travel logistics would confirm that barrels of preserved beef are easier to move around than live cattle. So if you want to see a great riverside park in West Texas and contemplate one of the earliest cattle drive routes in America, come check out the riverfront on the Natchez River at Collier's Ferry. Episode 148, Making Beef for Dinner. Increases in early 19th century cattle and new methods for cooking them. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. Last week I talked about the early expansion of the milk industry. This week focuses on the inevitable consequence of raising more dairy cattle. You also get more beef cattle, which means more people had the opportunity to eat more beef. And with the changes in the kitchen technology, less open hearth cookery, the way people were preparing beef was also changing. And even though the railroad was just barely a thing, just as with milk, the outlines of a railroad-ready beef industry were being sketched out. To trace these early lines and find out what an early beef casserole was, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that early 19th century cookery books were divided on the desirability of beef as an addition to the dinner table. And unlike the 18th century, where most cookbooks were reprints, adaptations, or straight-up plagiarism of English cookbooks, the 19th century starts to develop its own unique American style, vocabulary, and ways of thinking about food. I mean, we've just been through the whole biscuit thing. A valuable tool in this sort of discovery came from a very kind friend I found during the lost days of 2020. He found, purchased, and sent me a treasure, a bibliography of American cookery books from 1742 through 1860. Compiled and published by the American Antiquarian Society, this project was started in 1929 and went through several revisions. I have the 1972 publishing, which, while not complete, does cover everything that was recorded by the Library of Congress, includes items with large distribution, and for the first time in this edition, it also lists the first or nearly first cookbooks written in French, German, and Spanish published in the United States, which all came out in the 1840s. The American curiosity about French and other foreign foods was limited at this time, but the groundwork in this, as with many other things we take for granted, was being laid down. And so unlike earlier centuries where European traditions were held too tightly and only the ingredient substitution made the food American, here, American food starts to invent its own style. And the ways in which we start to consume beef in the 19th century make some of the greatest leaps. The first place I started to note the difference was in looking at the competing cookbooks of the age. Mary Randolph of extremely established Virginia is publishing her tried and true methods she had learned and worked out over the end of and the turn of the century. But other cooks were living in bustling new cities that were pushing the frontier in places like Kentucky and the territories on their way to becoming states that lined the western banks of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. The original 13 states, they had their toes in the Atlantic and still looked to Europe for many of their food traditions and opinions about what was good, fancy, and proper. But people in new towns facing the ever more commercially bustling rivers were considering what opportunities were offered by the clean water, rolling hills, plentiful lumber, and wide open spaces across the barrier of the Appalachian Range. Randolph considers beef a coarser food and notes that, quote, "Beef may look brown, but the whiter the other meats are, the more genteel are they. And if properly roasted, they may be perfectly done and quite white," unquote. This is hearkening back to the white foods and other delicate diets for delicate ladies and other refined people of earlier centuries. But out on the western edges of America, even doctors' wives, the local wealthy elite, were working up huge appetites while establishing themselves and creating society in new places. Some of the rules about delicate eating were thrown out the window. Everyone was hungry from building where they lived. For many people, the rule about only eating the old beef when the cow or ox it was harvested from was no longer useful was still true. But in other areas where the larger dairy farms were being established, with larger barns to fulfill cheese and butter deliveries along the new roads and canals, these farms were also providing more cattle, the male kind, destined to be food. In the early 19th century, a sort of scientific cattle breeding in America was just getting up on its wobbly legs. Improved navigation and ship design meant more European cattle with storied bloodlines was being brought over. Not as much as in the latter half of the century when steamships take over, but the scraggy, tough, all-terrain, Americanized cattle were no longer just fine. People had ideas and money to fund them. Just as with faster horses for the entertainment of horse racing, cattle breeds as investment were also getting started. The earliest inkling of developing separate breeding lines for dairy, beef, and work cattle, those oxen for hauling logs and wagons and such, were being considered. Along with some thoughts about selective breeding and the increased milk industry meant that more calves were being born than ever before, which meant even more calves than people had any intention of raising and supporting and working with into adulthood, which meant veal, a far whiter meat than beef, from an adult ox, was also rising in popularity and availability. There are typically as many or more recipes for veal in your early 19th century cookbook than there are for beef. In Randolph, there are 28 veal versus 21 for beef. She has one for corning and one for collaring, each ways of preserving veal, but of the beef recipes, 4 are preserving, and 2 more for making broth and stew out of the less choice parts. And in the far more pro-beef eating Lettice Bryan of The Kentucky Housewife, there are 52 veal preparations versus 42 for beef. And 10 of the beef recipes are for preparing beef for preservation or using said preserved items, pickled tongues, dried or corned beef, and so on, while all the veal recipes are for fresh meat. It is worth noting that while Bryan in The Kentucky Housewife has some recipes with similar or even the same names as Randolph, she almost always uses her own wording and in many cases slightly different methods. Also, Bryan is already recognizing that even the refined woman pushing the frontier is going to need more information than the cook of a well-established household or plantation. Her recipes are longer and contain more directions than Randolph's, as well as advice about managing the help. While some advice regarding household management is par for the course in most published cookbooks of the century, Bryan is one of the few that specifically uses the word slave, if only once. Most other published material courted ambiguity with the word servant. I did get a giggle after reading Randolph complain about some inferior cooks parboiling their meat before roasting it to, quote, plump it up, And then seeing that Brian recommends giving some of her roasts a quick bath in simmering water to make it more tender after roasting. Now, since Brian published after Randolph, there was not any of the direct sniping one finds in modern social media discourse, but that discovery was enjoyable to see all the same. The more old-fashioned cookbooks assume that they are reminder notes for knowledgeable cooks, while Brian is foreshadowing women having to learn or teach methods from books, rather than from long apprenticeships in kitchens or running households under the direction of a more experienced woman. For comparison, Amelia Simmons, in her American cookbook published in 1796, has about the same number of beef and veal recipes. But all of them are quite plain. They are to roast, to a la mode, to broil, to make soup or pie. She does have recipes for veal steak and stuffed veal, but not for beef. And her recipes are truly brief. For example, her compact instructions for roasting give fire type, brisk, and time, an hour per pound, and that tough old beef takes longer, that fork pricking is how you test for done, and that rare is preferred. And that's it. So the physical and social mobility of America is leaving its traces in its cookbooks. Before, cookbooks were assumed to be purchased if you were already trained as a cook. But with Brian, there are hints that one might buy a cookbook to become a cook or to learn to cook for your new family, something that absolutely begins to happen at the end of the century for a lot more women. The increase in meat eating, and beef eating particularly, doesn't just show up in these fancy people cookbooks either. You can tell the Kentucky Housewife is a fancy cookbook because it includes recipes for things like ice creams and lobsters cooked alive, which were both newfangled fancy ideas in early America. Beef and simple meat recipes also show up in cookbooks with names like The American Frugal Housewife, The New England American Housekeeper, The Family Receipt Book, and New American Cookery. They were not only designating an American style or even regional styles within America, they were creating the reality that women cooking for their families might also buy cookery books, not just housekeepers of larger estates or women running great or grand houses. Now, instead of a collection of reused paper scraps or even a precious notebook with a few penciled notes of requested recipes, the farmer's wife might also have a cookbook as well. For American women were more likely to be at least a bit literate and somewhat able to do basic math, quite different from many of their European counterparts. This partly goes back to the Protestant weirdos who had a hand in founding the colonies way back in season 1. They wanted to read the Bible themselves, so literacy for all their children, even the girls, was common. And the heathens they were determined on converting, they were sometimes taught to read in service of reading the Bible. Numeracy, on the other hand, came with the commerce-directed life of many early Americans. The more people on your farm that could add and subtract and convert pounds of wheat into a fair price in, say, butter or coin, well, the better for you. Running your own business wasn't just an accident of birth or an oddity the way it had been for so many back in Europe. In America, it was the way of life. Remember, the early colonies, not begun as religious ventures, were often based on business propositions. So a strange result of this was that more women than might be expected could read and so had uses for their own cookbooks. And in there, whether you were fancy or proudly plain, you would find lots of meat recipes and many more than you would think were starting to be for beef and associated cattle parts. At this point, what most people were eating most of the time when they ate meat was pork or fish if they made their living on a shoreline. But as the number of cattle grew, so did the presence of beef on the plate. And it wasn't just more cattle. There was also new technology when it came to preparing foods. Stoves, more pots, tin kitchens, roasters, and so on. So what were the new ways to eat beef for the people that got it? If you were enslaved or indentured or labored for wages, you likely still saw mostly pork and very little to no beef. And if you did, it was likely in drippings from fat saved from other cooking applications or in broth made from the bones and scraps of more recognizable cuts. And if you were eating only your old oxen and retired milk cows, well, then you worked your way through the entire animal. Parts we would normally think of as steaks were still tough and very stringy, but low in fat and made of large continuous muscles, so best for slicing into thin pieces and making into dried beef. This was the preferred method when dealing with beef when it was too warm to pickle or corn beef. These methods of salting and keeping beef in brine depended on water saturated with salt, that is, strong enough brine to bear up an egg. But for the pickle to be successful and outrun rot, the weather needed to be fairly cool or, even better, actually cold. So along with dried beef, stews and broths and gravies were made. The perpetual stew that lived on in the back of the fire was one answer to what do you do when it's too hot to preserve meat? When you can't keep something cold enough to stop the rot, keep it too hot to rot. And so those iron pots burbling over a fire were a plausible solution in the ages before refrigeration. Corning, salting, pickling, and collaring were all still on the table, but as more people lived closer together, they could barter for fresh cuts or get them from the increasing number of butchers. And with that, a whole new set of recipes based on going to the butcher and purchasing a bit of beef started to evolve. In the northern states where dairies were more common, beef suet, the hardest fat from beef, became a preferred substitute for butter over lard in things like pie crusts. It also takes a prominent place in puddings and in mincemeat. While these are callbacks to British dishes, they are also signals that there's just more beef, and thus beef fat, available even to the frugal. Chopped lean beef starts to show up in pies, where rabbit, wild bird, venison, squirrels, and even fish had been more common. The dream of covering the land with cattle, as spoken of in the 17th century, was starting, in a way, to come true. Where the English cookbooks the 18th century cooks were referring to had fish and wild bird pies and often used the plucks, the innards of beef, pig, sheep, and venison, along with rabbits, in America, there was starting to be more beef to go around, especially the tough, stringy stuff that needed to be chopped and seasoned to be edible, and that would go into these same pies. Sure, it might be stretched with breadcrumbs, but again, as with the beef, there's also more wheat for bread and wheat to make a pie crust. You'd think in a society where cornmeal was king, something more along the lines of the tamale would develop, something like pie fillings encased in a cornmeal crust. But no, all that extra wheat, the spread of the mills, and the English affinity for wheat meant that wheat pie crust survived the wheat shortage of the previous century. And as a result, it keeps making the Frito pie and the walking taco exciting discoveries for Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts alike. Now, if you had more money or were working on a farm, there were also larger cuts to be made into meals. Many of the New England and frugal cookbooks are assuming smaller households and provide instructions for modest and, to us, recognizable amounts of meat. The fancier cookbooks, on the other hand, assume the cook is facing an expansive table. These days, a rump roast or a pot roast or a round roast or a rib roast clocking in at 5 pounds often seems large and would provide plenty of leftovers for a while. But the recipes in the fancy cookbooks for the cook making food for a large household often includes instruction for 8 pounds of meat to go into making gravy or broth, 20 pounds or entire rounds, or 15 pounds or all of a rump, and complete pieces of plate and brisket, which even in these smaller cows were regularly over 10 pounds, especially with all the bones. Many kitchen instructions also give directions for using a saw to deal with those bones. But even the fancy tables were not always full, so it is more common to find recipes that instruct you to, quote, take a nice piece, or a piece of suitable size, or a piece the size you wish, and generally to cut a piece of the proper size. So all of this, even when extra instructions are included, is depending heavily on a cook with experience. Many of the ways of cooking beef remain the same from the last century to this, with spit roasting being the pinnacle. Not only does spit roasting over an open fire produce the most desired form of cooked beef, cooked to the proper temperature on the inside, but also with care creates a crispy fried flour crust on the outside. This method also takes the most care and attention. As a result, different methods for rotating roasts by other means than the busy cook would continue to be innovated. Most famously in the past, there were fire boys and dogs on treadmills set to turn the roasts. In the early 19th century, there are certainly the children assigned to meat watching duty, but there are also roasting jacks or spit jacks, clockwork mechanisms that can be wound up, much like a ticking clock, to rotate the roast using gears. The roasting jack or spit jack has a lineage of a few hundred years at this point. Just everyone's always coming up with a better and, more importantly, locally available version. The earliest versions used a descending weight, again, directly from early clock-making design. And as spring technology improved in clocks, those springs were also applied to roasting jacks. There were a few steam-powered jacks invented, the first one patented in the U.S. in 1792. That strikes me as cumbersome and needlessly dangerous. A kitchen had plenty of frightening objects of its own, without introducing vessels of pressurized steam. A more sensible way to go in for a complicated piece of heat-driven machinery was a smoke jack that created the turning motion by capturing the energy of the hot air rising up the chimney on something that resembled a windmill. However, if you didn't have any of this newfangled machinery or a semi-trustworthy small child to keep things spinning, the simplest method was to attach a smaller piece of meat to a piece of twine that you would periodically wind to keep the meat turning. Having seen this in action, it's surprisingly practical, and done sensibly doesn't actually result in meat juices continuously flying about the kitchen. And of course, another approach was to do away with most of the pesky rotation and simply build something that would reflect the heat of the fire all around the roasting piece of meat. The initial version of this was the tin kitchen, or what was called in some books a Dutch oven. It was more or less a rectangular metal box lined with reflective tin with one open side. The open side was placed facing the fire, and ideally the heat was bounced around the box and reached all sides of the meat. The tin kitchen, of course, was just one step away from the newfangled cast iron plate stoves and baking boxes or metal ovens that were being built into fireplaces and were starting to arrive on the American cooking scene. Just as with Randolph's complaint about cheating cooks that pre-plumped their roast by boiling them briefly, there were plenty of the older generation of cooks that looked upon placing roasts within an iron box to roast it as simply baking the meat. And it was not the same thing at all. In fact, it was possibly shameful to claim that such meat had been roasted. And yes, the entire outdoor and open fire cookery industrial complex in modern America can attest to that. Meat that has been oven roasted is quite a different thing from something that has been grilled or spit roasted over an open flame, a brisk, clear flame, as our cooks would call for. But for the busy cook with all manner of things to prepare, stop, start, and keep an eye on, the oven, with a fairly regular temperature or a more easily regulated temperature, was heartily and excitedly welcomed. So what did your beef taste like most of the time? The beef stews and soups were fairly plain, depending on salt and the contributions of onions, other root vegetables, salt, herbs, and sometimes some spices. Actually, not far off from modern American beef stews. Some were watery, some were plain, and some were likely inviting and savory as anchovy, mushroom, and even early tomato ketchups were regularly added as flavoring agents at the end, if you had a good cook with a well-stocked pantry. Spit roasted meats, those might be rubbed about with a little spice, but were generally roasted plain and then dusted with flour, maybe some salt and spice to finish. This was basted with butter or clarified fat to brown the flour at the end. That gave it the savory, crispy crust when it was brought to the table. And this beef would be served as is, or maybe with one of the simple sauces of butter and something, or cream and egg yolks and something. Or it might come with a little gravy. Most of the developing elaborate sauces were saved for cold meats, were constituted and braised, salted, smoked, and corned meats that were pressed, sliced thinly, and served for simpler meals. Relishes and pickles were common accompaniments for this and might be a regular portion of a lighter supper. Remember, midday dinner was still the major meal. Cold sliced brisket, pickled tongue, and collared loin were all typical fare here. But there were a few items that started to appear more regularly. The steak cooked on the gridiron and items baked or braised within these new-fangled ovens. It starts to be common to take large cuts of meat, rub them all over with salt and spices, prick them with a knife, and stuff them with a combination of things like bacon fat, bone marrow, forcemeat, bread, and herbs, and then place them in a large pan with wine or other liquids, sometimes with carrots, turnips, or potatoes, and instead of spit roasting the meat or stewing it, they are instead left to bake in an oven. Back in Amelia Simmons' 1796 cookbook, there are slices of tender beef 1 inch thick that are cooked directly on the coals, or even thinner slices were placed in a pewter dish in just enough water to cover. The heat produced by burning strips of newspapers introduced sequentially would be used as the heat to cook it. The directions for both methods indicate they need to be seasoned at the end with a bit of salt, black pepper, and butter to be made palatable. But just a few decades later, the steaks are now cooked on a gridiron, that is, on a grid made of iron, placed over coals or over a quick, clear fire. The steaks may be thinner, 1/2 inch, or up to 1.5 inches thick. There are even instructions to pound some of them, but not the veal steaks, before cooking, then dredge them in seasoned flour, and to fry them in lard. Yes, in 1839, there's already basically the recipe for chicken fried steak running around America. It even comes with a suggestion of serving it with a cream gravy made by thickening the meat juices with flour and cream and flavoring it with parsley and a little onion. Or, it says, you might enjoy it with anchovy ketchup, mushroom ketchup, or even, yes, tomato ketchup. That's right, the first sighting of a fried steak with basically Worcestershire sauce, that is anchovy or mushroom ketchup, or tomato ketchup, jumped out at me from Lettice Bryan's 1939, The Kentucky Housewife. And she's not done displaying the cutting edge of early 19th century cookery that's still with us today. Unlike other cookbooks that stop at old standbys like sausage, pie, and hash, fricandeau, and a la mode, along with roasts, she gives us beef olives and a beef casserole. That's CASSEE space ROLL. Beef olives and their twin veal olives appear in several books. These are small slices of meat, pounded thin, then stuffed with a variety of savories. Things like forcemeat, marrow, herbs, and bread are all typical. They're rolled up tightly, skewered, and rotated before a fire to brown them nicely. When done, these are served in a dish with a thick gravy or savory bread sauce. So more or less like a deconstructed casserole. Other versions of stuffed skewered beef appear under names like beef malaga. But the beef casserole, on the other hand, is the real thing. The slices of pounded stuffed beef, here filled with salt, pepper, nutmeg, grated bread, butter, and oysters, they're rolled tightly and are larded, that is, strips of lard are threaded into the meat with a larding needle. The whole is dusted with flour, placed in a pan of suitable size, and surrounded with a mixture of water, wine, and maybe some ketchup or pickle. The whole construction is then covered over with a layer of bacon and then some paper, which is basically a tinfoil precursor to prevent overbrowning. It is placed in an oven of moderate heat and baked until done. While the particular flavors and methods of preparation might be out of our time, nutmeg and oysters, the combination of meat, starch, and seasonings with a flavorful sauce baked together is an entirely recognizable version of a modern casserole, though there might be some who object on the grounds that there is a notable absence of any cheese. Recognizable elements of the American beef menu are appearing, along with the casserole and the fried steak with ketchup. Though there are still several flavor options, there are also many recipes for beef to be cooked and pressed and served cold. With the increasing availability of wheat flour and the transport of cheese along the new canals, the roast beef sandwich is likely spontaneously appearing at taverns or in laborers' pockets as a breakfast they can grab on the way out of a boarding house. And such sandwiches could even include pickles or horseradish, both easy things to find in any pantry in those days. So were such things, casseroles, steaks with ketchup, and roast beef sandwiches, ubiquitous yet? Or even common? No. They were not the sort of thing people were writing about, as they were not official. But the elements were all around, just waiting to be pictured or drawn or spread about on the currently under construction train lines that were littered all over the young U.S. America is becoming a beef nation in the early 19th century. The early century enthusiasm for butter and cheese was the driver, and meat was just a natural byproduct, but one that was darn tasty. The meat was also a useful supply for the building of cities and transportation that was going on. Liquid milk as a mainstay is still off in the future. It's not yet the indispensable beverage of childhood it would become. First, we need more factories to work in, more things to buy, more stores to sell them, and the railroads to move all the goods about. So next episode, I'll take a look at all these things, the developing commercial culture of America and how cheaper cotton, produced by the labor of enslaved Africans, wound up in the advertising that did and does drive consumer culture. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know that you are out there, but even better yet are your reviews. And let me know how you feel about fried steak with cream gravy or tomato ketchup showing up already in 1839. I'm sure it appears earlier somewhere, I just haven't dug hard enough, but let me know if you've seen it. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.